The train was running late. That was the only reason Marcus Hale was in that particular car, on that particular evening, standing in the narrow aisle with his hand wrapped around an overhead rail and his mind somewhere entirely else. He had missed the 6:15 by 40 seconds. He had watched it pull away from the platform with the particular cruelty of something that does not know it is being watched. So he had bought a coffee he did not want from a vendor who charged too much, found a bench, and waited for the 6:52 with the resigned patience of a man who had learned that fighting small losses was a waste of energy better saved for larger ones. He was 31 years old. He worked in architectural drafting for a firm that valued precision over everything else. He lived alone in a one-bedroom apartment on the east side of the city where the rent was manageable and the neighbors were quiet, and the view from his kitchen window was a brick wall that he had, over 3 years of mornings, come to find oddly comforting. He was not unhappy. He was also not particularly happy. He existed in the wide, unremarkable middle ground that most people occupy for most of their lives and mistake for contentment. He was not looking for anything that evening. That is always how it begins. The 6:52 was crowded in the way that trains are crowded on wet Thursday evenings in November, bodies pressed without apology into shared space, the smell of damp coats and takeaway food, the collective exhaustion of a city that had been asking too much of its people for too long. Marcus found a standing position near the doors at the far end of the third car and resumed his interrupted thoughts about a structural calculation that had been bothering him since Tuesday. He almost missed her entirely. She was seated 4 rows from the doors, her back straight, her legs crossed at the ankle in the particular way of someone who had been taught to take up exactly as much space as was allocated and not 1 inch more. She wore a coat the color of dark wine, and her hair was pinned up with the kind of careless precision that takes either 10 seconds or 40 minutes and is impossible to tell which. She was reading. Not looking at a phone, not staring at the middle distance with headphones sealing her off from the world, but actually reading, a hardback book held open in both hands, her eyes moving across the page with the focused absorption of someone who had genuinely left this train car and gone somewhere else entirely. Marcus noticed her the way you notice a fire in a dark room, not because you are looking for warmth, simply because light draws the eye, and some people carry a kind of light that has nothing to do with beauty, though she was that too, and everything to do with the quality of their attention. He looked away. He was good at looking away. The train swayed as it rounded the long curve before Meridian Street Station, the kind of lurch that veterans of this particular line know to brace for and newcomers do not. Marcus shifted his weight automatically. 4 rows ahead, the woman did not shift at all, but the book did. It slid from her hands with the clean inevitability of something that was always going to happen, arcing out from between her fingers and dropping toward the floor in the narrow space between her seat and the one facing her. Marcus moved without deciding to. 3 steps, one hand releasing the overhead rail, one arm reaching down into the gap before the book hit the floor. His fingers closed around the spine a half-second before impact. He straightened up. The woman was already looking at him, not with the startled gratitude of someone who has just been surprised, but with a calm, measuring attention, as if she had been watching him for longer than the 3 seconds the whole thing had taken. He held the book out to her. She looked at it, then at him, then she took it. Her fingers brushed his as she did, not deliberately, not meaningfully, just the ordinary contact of 2 hands exchanging an object on a crowded train on a wet Thursday evening in November. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was low and even and carried the faint trace of an accent he could not place, not foreign exactly, just from somewhere other than here. He nodded, said nothing, turned and walked back to his position near the doors. The train pulled into Meridian Street and half the car emptied. Marcus found a seat. He did not look back at her. He thought about his structural calculation for approximately 4 minutes before realizing he was not thinking about his structural calculation at all. At the next stop, she gathered her things. He watched, without meaning to, as she stood and buttoned her coat and tucked the book into a bag that hung from her shoulder. She did not look at him again. She moved toward the doors with the quiet purposefulness of someone who always knows exactly where they are going. The doors opened. She stepped out onto the platform, and the crowd folded around her, and she was gone. Marcus sat with the faint warmth of where her fingers had brushed his, and told himself that was the end of it. The train doors closed. He was wrong. Marcus made the same journey the following Thursday. He told himself it was because the 6:52 was simply his train now. He had missed the 6:15 again, this time by a wider margin, a meeting that ran long, a colleague who needed one more minute that became 7, and the 6:52 was the logical alternative. That was all. There was nothing deliberate about it. A man takes the train that is available. That is not a decision. That is just life arranging itself around circumstance. He believed this for approximately 3 days before he stopped trying to. The truth was simpler and more inconvenient. He had thought about her, not constantly, not in the consuming way of someone struck by something they cannot name, but in the way a small stone sits in a shoe, present, specific, impossible to ignore for long. He would be in the middle of a calculation, and his mind would drift, not to her face exactly, but to the quality of her stillness. The way she had been so completely inside that book that the whole crowded train had ceased to exist for her. The way she had looked at him afterward, not startled, not flustered, just awake to him in a way that felt different from the ordinary social transaction of a small kindness acknowledged and filed away. He had not gotten her name. He had not asked. He had stood 3 feet from her for 40 minutes on a moving train, and the only words exchanged between them were 2 of hers and none of his, and he had walked off that train and into the rest of his evening as if the whole thing were nothing, because what was it really? A book caught. A thank you given. The brief overlap of 2 strangers in shared transit. These things happened 100 times a day in a city of 8 million people, and meant nothing and led nowhere, and were forgotten by morning. He had not forgotten by morning. He went back the following Thursday. She was not there. He sat in the same section of the same car and watched the doors at each stop with the casual alertness of someone trying very hard to appear as though he is doing nothing of the sort. She did not appear. The seat where she had been sat occupied by a heavy-set man in a grey suit who fell asleep before the second stop and snored with impressive commitment until his own station. Marcus rode to the end of the line and back, which he had never done before and would not have been able to explain to anyone who asked. She was not on the return journey either. He walked home through the rain without an umbrella because he had left it at the office that morning, and the cold November water ran down the back of his collar, and he felt, with some clarity, the particular foolishness of a man who has ridden a train twice in one evening, looking for a woman whose name he does not know and whose face he has seen for a combined total of perhaps 4 minutes. He bought groceries. He cooked a meal he ate without tasting. He sat at his desk and finished the structural calculation that had been bothering him since Tuesday and found, on completion, that it gave him none of its usual satisfaction. He went to bed early. He lay in the dark and thought with unusual precision about the weight of the book in his hand. It had been substantial. Hardback, well-worn, the spine cracked from repeated reading. He had not seen the title. He had been looking at her when she took it back. He wished now he had looked at the title. It would have been something to know. A small specific fact to carry, a coordinate in the otherwise featureless geography of a person he had no way of finding. He told himself to stop. He told himself this was the ordinary inflation that loneliness performs on small moments, that he was a man who spent his days in precise, measurable work and his evenings in a quiet apartment with a brick wall for a view, and that such a life made ordinary moments feel significant simply because significant moments were rare. He was not special. The encounter was not special. He had caught a falling book. That was all. He almost convinced himself. The following Thursday he was on the 6:52 again. And the Thursday after that. And the one after that. 3 Thursdays of finding her seat empty. 3 Thursdays of riding through stations in the particular suspension of someone waiting for something they will not admit to waiting for. He began to notice other things about the car, the student who always sat at the far end with headphones the size of satellite dishes, the elderly man who boarded at Coldwell Street with a folded newspaper he never opened, the teenage girl who drew in a sketchbook with total concentration from one end of the line to the other. He noticed these people because he was not finding her, and his attention had to go somewhere. On the fifth Thursday, something changed. He almost did not go. It had been a difficult week. A project had gone sideways, and his supervisor had handled it with the particular brand of managerial disappointment that is worse than anger because it implies a lowered expectation. Marcus had come home on Wednesday night feeling scraped thin and had sat on the edge of his bed for a long time thinking about the gap between the life he had imagined at 22 and the life he was living at 31. He nearly took a different route home on Thursday, a bus that dropped him 2 streets from his apartment, direct, no transfers, 22 minutes door to door. He took the train instead. He could not have told you why. He boarded the 6:52. He moved to the third car out of habit now, out of the particular stubbornness of a ritual that has not yet paid off, but has gone on long enough to feel like a commitment. He found his position near the far doors. And there she was. Same coat, same seat. The book open in her hands, different book this time, but held with the same two-handed absorption, the same quality of having gone somewhere the rest of the car had not been invited. Marcus stood very still for a moment. Then he walked to the overhead rail above his usual position and wrapped his hand around it and stared at the dark window opposite and felt his heart doing something he had no technical language for. She had not seen him, or if she had, she gave no sign. The train moved through its stations. Marcus did not move. He was aware of her the way you are aware of a sound just below the threshold of hearing, not directly perceivable, but changing the quality of everything around it. At Meridian Street, the car emptied and filled again. A young woman sat down in the seat directly facing the woman in the dark wine coat, blocking his sightline. Marcus shifted positions slightly. He was disgusted with himself and also completely unable to stop. The train swayed on the curve before the next station. He watched her hands tighten on the book automatically, the small learned adjustment of someone who had ridden this particular line before and remembered exactly where the lurch came. She remembered. She had been here before, was here regularly or had been, and then had not been for 5 weeks, and now was again. There was a pattern to it, or there had been a break in the pattern, or both, and he had no way of knowing which. What he knew was this: she was on this train, he was on this train. He had caught her book once and said nothing, and she had thanked him and said nothing, and they had parted ways as thoroughly as 2 people can part ways after 40 minutes of shared space. He could do nothing again. He was very good at doing nothing. The train pulled into the next station. The young woman across from her gathered her things and left. The seat was empty again. Marcus looked at it, looked at the distance between where he was standing and where it sat. 7 feet, maybe 8. He did not move. 3 more stops passed. He stood at the doors, and she sat in her seat, and the city moved past the windows, and the distance between them stayed exactly what it was. At the stop before hers, he did not know it was the stop before hers, but it was. She looked up from her book. Not at him, just up, the way readers do when they surface briefly from one world to check that the other one is still there. Her eyes moved across the car, and then, with no particular urgency and no change of expression, they found him. She looked at him for 3 seconds. He looked back. She did not smile, did not nod, did not give any of the social signals that would have made the moment readable and therefore manageable. She simply looked at him with the same calm measuring attention as before, the quality of someone taking note of something they intend to remember. Then she looked back down at her book. At the next stop she stood, buttoned her coat and left. Marcus rode the train to the end of the line again. He sat in the empty car with the city lights moving past the dark window and understood, with the quiet resignation of a man who has tried to talk himself out of something and failed completely, that he was not going to stop coming back. He also understood that if he did not find the courage to speak to her, he was going to spend a very long time on this train for no reason at all. The thought should have been clarifying. It was, just not in the way he hoped. Because somewhere in the back of his mind, in the place where honest things live when a person is not ready to say them out loud, Marcus Hale already knew that whatever this was, it was not going to resolve itself neatly. Some things do not resolve neatly. Some things take 3 years. He spoke to her on a Tuesday. Not a Thursday, a Tuesday, which meant nothing was planned, nothing was prepared, nothing had been rehearsed in the bathroom mirror of his quiet apartment on the east side of the city. He had worked late, a deadline that moved without warning, the way deadlines do when the people setting them do not have to meet them. He had left the office at 7:40 with his coat half-buttoned and his mind still tangled in load-bearing calculations, and he had descended into the station without thinking about anything except whether he had enough eggs at home to constitute a meal. She was standing on the platform, not sitting in a train car where the distance between them was managed and the exits were guaranteed. Standing on the platform in the crowd, her bag on her shoulder, her book open in her hands, even standing, reading in the 5 minutes of waiting the way some people cannot help but read in every available silence, because the silence would otherwise be too loud. Marcus stopped walking. Then he started again, because stopping in a crowd on a train platform is not something a person can do without becoming an obstacle, and becoming an obstacle was the least dignified way he could think of to begin whatever this was. He moved through the crowd until he was standing beside her. Close enough to speak, not so close as to crowd. She did not look up. He looked at the book in her hands. The cover was visible this time, a dark spine with gold lettering. A novel he had read 3 years ago and thought about since, in the way you think about books that show you something about yourself you were not expecting to see. He said quietly that it was a good book. She looked up, not startled, not the sudden surface break of someone pulled out of deep water, just a smooth, unhurried lift of the eyes, as if some part of her had already known he was there and had been waiting to see what he would do with the proximity. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said she knew. She had read it 4 times. He said he had read it once and thought about it more than most things he had read more than once. Something shifted in her expression, not a smile exactly, the movement of something underneath a smile, the small interior adjustment of a person who has just been given an answer they were not expecting from a question they did not ask aloud. She said, "What part stayed with you?" He told her, not the part most people mentioned, not the obvious emotional climax that the reviews had praised, but a smaller moment near the middle of the book. A scene where the protagonist sits in a train station and watches a man read a letter and realizes she will never know what the letter says, and understands in that moment that most of the important things happening in the world are happening just out of her sight and always will be. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said that was the part that stayed with her too. The train came. They boarded together without discussing it, without the awkward negotiation of 2 strangers deciding whether proximity is acceptable. They simply moved with the crowd and ended up in the same car and stood near the same doors, and the city began to move past the windows. She told him her name was Selin. He told her his was Marcus. She asked what he did, and he told her, and she listened with the full quality of attention he had noticed from a distance and found, up close, to be even more disorienting than he had imagined. She was not performing interest. She was simply interested. It was a distinction that most people never managed, and she seemed unaware that it was unusual. He asked what she did. She paused for just a moment before answering, long enough to be noticeable, short enough to seem like ordinary consideration. She said she worked in diplomatic relations. He said that was vague. She said yes, it was. She said it in a way that was not unfriendly and not an invitation to press further. Simply a door left where it was, neither opened nor locked. He left it where she left it. They rode 4 stops together. At the 5th, she said this was hers. He said it was not his, but he had ridden past it before. She looked at him, then with an expression he could not fully read, something between recognition and something older and more careful than recognition. She said she knew. The doors opened. She stepped through them, turned once on the platform and looked at him through the glass as the doors closed. Not smiling, just looking. The train pulled away. Marcus stood in the car with her name in his mouth, like something he was afraid to swallow, in case it disappeared. Selin. He said it once, quietly, to no one. It felt like the beginning of something enormous. He had no idea yet how enormous. They met again the following Tuesday. Not by arrangement. There had been no exchange of numbers on that first evening, no plans made, no careful negotiation of when and where. She had stepped off the train and looked at him through the closing doors, and that had been the entirety of what passed between them as a promise. And yet, Tuesday evening, 6:52, third car from the front. She was already there when he boarded, standing this time, not sitting, her back against the panel beside the doors with her book closed for once and held against her chest instead of open in her hands, as if she had known the reading would not be possible tonight and had not pretended otherwise. She saw him immediately. He walked toward her and she did not look away, and he came to stand beside her in the small space between the doors and the first row of seats, and the train moved, and neither of them spoke for a full minute, and somehow the silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who have already said something true to each other and are not yet sure what comes next, but are not afraid of the interval. She spoke first. She asked if he always rode past his stop. He said he did not always do anything. She considered this. Then she said that was either very honest or very evasive, and she had not decided which. He said it was probably both. The almost smile again, that interior movement just beneath the surface. He was beginning to understand that this was how she laughed, not with sound and open expression, but with something that happened behind her eyes and at the very corners of her mouth, small and precise and entirely genuine. He asked about the book against her chest, why closed tonight. She looked down at it as if she had forgotten she was holding it, then back up at him. She said some evenings the book was not enough company. He felt the weight of that sentence settle in his chest and did not know what to do with it, so he said nothing, which turned out to be the right response because she nodded slightly, as if he had passed some small test she had not announced she was administering. They rode together for 6 stops that evening, longer than before. The conversation moved the way good conversations move when 2 people are genuinely matched, not in a straight line, but in widening circles, each exchange opening into something slightly larger than the one before it. They talked about the book, then about the nature of stories that stay, then about the difference between a city you live in and a city you inhabit, then about the particular loneliness of precision work, his, and the particular loneliness of work that cannot be precisely described, hers. She was careful about what she said regarding her work. Not secretive in a way that felt like deception, more like someone who had learned, through experience, that certain information changed the shape of a conversation in ways that were not always useful. She talked around the edges of it with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing so for a long time. He noticed, but did not push. At the 6th stop, she said she had to change lines. He said he would ride with her to the connection. She looked at him for a moment, then she said all right. They stood on the platform waiting for the connecting train, and the cold came off the tunnel walls, and she pulled her coat tighter, and he almost said something, and then did not, and then the train came and they boarded, and rode 2 more stops to where her line diverged from any direction that made sense for him. On the platform, she turned to face him properly for the first time that evening. Square, unhurried, with the full quality of her attention directed at him like something physical. She said she wanted to tell him something. He said, "All right." She said she had seen him on the train before the Tuesday he had spoken to her. She had seen him on Thursday evenings, in the same car, standing near the same doors. She had noticed him the way you notice someone who is trying not to be noticed, which is to say immediately and completely. Marcus said nothing. She said she was not telling him this to embarrass him. She was telling him because she thought he should know that he had not been as invisible as he believed. The train indicator above them counted down, 2 minutes to the next service. He asked why she had not said anything, all those Thursdays, all that careful, studied nothing. She was quiet for a moment. Her expression did something complex that he did not have enough knowledge of her yet to fully read. She said she had been waiting to see what kind of man he was. Whether he would speak or simply keep coming back and saying nothing indefinitely. Whether his courage was real or only theoretical. Whether he was someone who acted on what he felt or someone who preferred the safety of almost. He asked which she had concluded. She looked at him steadily. She said the jury was still out. Then she smiled, not the almost smile this time. A real one, brief and unguarded and startlingly warm, there and gone in the space of a breath, like a door opened onto a lit room and then gently closed again. She said good night. She boarded her train. Marcus stood on the platform as it pulled away and felt the cold tunnel air move through him and understood several things simultaneously. That she had been watching him as carefully as he had been watching her. That she was someone who tested quietly and waited patiently and drew her conclusions from behavior rather than words. That the jury she had mentioned was a real jury with real stakes, and that he was already, without having agreed to it, on trial. And underneath all of that, something else. Something he could not have named precisely, but that sat in his chest with the specific weight of things that are true before you are ready for them to be. He was in serious trouble. The good kind. The kind that changes the shape of everything that comes after. He walked to the exit with his hands in his pockets and the ghost of her real smile still somewhere in the air around him, and thought that whatever the jury decided, he was not going to make it easy for them to find against him. He was going to show up. Every Tuesday, every Thursday, whatever it took. He did not know yet that showing up would not be enough, that there were things coming that no amount of showing up could prepare him for, that the woman whose real smile he was still carrying home on a cold Tuesday evening in November existed in a world that was about to make itself known to him in ways that would test everything he thought he understood about courage and choice, and what it means to want something you were never supposed to have. He did not know any of that yet. He just walked and smiled and rode the wrong train home for the third time in 2 weeks without minding even slightly. They had been meeting on Tuesdays and Thursdays for 6 weeks when she told him. Not everything, not at once. She was not the kind of person who gave everything at once. She rationed truth the way careful people ration water in uncertain terrain, enough to sustain, never enough to flood. But 6 weeks of train rides had become 6 weeks of platform conversations that stretched past the last service and into the cold night air of the street above the station. 6 weeks of walking in the same direction, even when it was not quite the right direction for either of them. 6 weeks of the kind of talking that does not feel like talking, because it feels more like thinking out loud to the only person you have ever met who thinks in a similar enough language to understand the grammar of it. Marcus had learned things about her. She had grown up in 4 countries before the age of 16. She spoke 5 languages and was functional in 2 more. She read compulsively and competitively, keeping a running list in a small notebook of every book she had finished since she was 12 years old. The list currently ran to 437 titles. She could not cook anything that required more than one pan, but made coffee with a seriousness that bordered on ceremonial. She had a laugh she kept in reserve, only deployed when something genuinely earned it, and when it came, it was sudden and whole, and made everything in its vicinity feel briefly extraordinary. He had learned these things the way you learn things about someone who is being careful, slowly, sideways, from the edges inward. What he had not learned was the center, the diplomatic relations that she described in careful vagueness, the phone calls she stepped away to take, turning her back and lowering her voice with the practiced ease of someone for whom private conversations in public spaces was simply a condition of life. The occasional cancellation, a Thursday she was simply not there, no explanation, and then the following Tuesday she was back, as if the gap had not happened, present and warm and entirely unapologetic. He had not pushed. He had told himself he was respecting her privacy. That was true. He had also told himself he was afraid of what the center might contain. That was truer. On a Thursday, in the third week of December, she did not board at her usual station. She boarded 2 stops later, slightly breathless, her coat buttoned wrong by one, a detail she noticed and corrected without breaking stride as she walked toward him through the car. Something about the sight of her fixing her coat button while simultaneously navigating a moving train and locating him in a crowd made something shift permanently in his chest. She sat down beside him instead of standing. She had never sat beside him before, always standing, always the slight formality of adjacent space. This was different. This was the removal of a distance that had been maintained for reasons, and its removal felt like a statement. He did not comment on it. She was quiet for a moment, looking at her hands in her lap, a stillness that was different from her usual stillness, not the peace of someone at rest, but the concentration of someone preparing. She said she needed to tell him something. He said, all right. She said it was complicated. He said most things worth knowing were. She looked at him then, a long, measuring look that reminded him of the very first time, on the train platform in the rain, when she had taken the book from his hands and looked at him as if she were filing something important away for later. She said her full name was Selin Karasay. He said it was a beautiful name. She said yes, it was also the name printed on documents that described her as the second daughter of Imre Karasay. He did not know the name immediately. He was an architect. He spent his days thinking about load-bearing walls and stress tolerances and the mathematics of structures that were meant to outlast the people who built them. The names of men who moved in other kinds of structures had not been his study. But something in the way she said it, the particular weight she placed beneath it, the careful way she watched his face as the name landed, told him the name was supposed to mean something. He said he was sorry, he did not know the name. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he could not read. Then she said good. She said it simply and with a warmth that confused him until she explained. Her father was the head of one of the oldest and most politically connected families in her country of origin, a man whose influence extended across 3 governments and 2 continents, a man whose elder daughter had married a European minister and whose younger daughter, Selin, had been educated at the finest institutions on 4 continents and groomed with the patient, deliberate care of someone building something meant to last for a specific future. The future had a name too. She said it without looking at him. A man 38, the son of a prime minister. Decent, she said, not unkind, not someone she had chosen but someone who had been arrived at through the kind of careful negotiation that her world called courtship and the rest of the world would have called something else entirely. The arrangement was not yet formal, but it was close. There were families involved. There were advisors. There were conversations happening in rooms she was not present for about her future and the futures her future would make possible. She said all of this quietly and without drama, the way you describe weather, something that exists outside of personal preference, something that simply is. Marcus listened without speaking. The train moved through its stations. The city slid past the dark windows. He sat with everything she had just told him and felt it rearranging something in the architecture of the last 6 weeks, the way a single structural calculation revised can change the load distribution of an entire building. He asked why she was telling him. She was quiet for a long moment. She said because she had been raised to be honest about the things that were fair to be honest about. He said, and this was one of them. She said yes. He asked what it meant for Tuesdays and Thursdays. She looked at him with an expression that was the most unguarded thing he had seen from her, not the real smile, something rawer than that, something that lived below the smile in the place where people keep the things they are not yet sure they are allowed to feel. She said she did not know. She said she knew what it was supposed to mean. She said she was less certain about what it actually meant. The train reached her stop. She stood, buttoned her coat, correctly this time, all the way up against the December cold. She looked down at him. She said she would understand if next Tuesday he was not there. He looked up at her and said nothing. She nodded once, then she moved toward the doors. He watched her step off the train and onto the platform and walk without looking back toward the exit, with the straight-backed composure of someone who has said a necessary thing and is now living in the space after it. The doors closed. Marcus sat in the emptying car and looked at the dark window and saw his own reflection looking back at him. A man sitting alone on a train at night with the particular expression of someone who has just been handed a choice they did not ask for and cannot put back down. He thought about load-bearing walls, about the difference between a structure that holds and one that only appears to, about the mathematics of things worth building even when the ground beneath them was uncertain. He rode to the end of the line. He did not go home for a long time. The following Tuesday, he was on the 6:52. Third car from the front. She was already there. Neither of them said anything about it. They didn't need to. January came the way it always does in that city. Without apology. The temperature dropped to the kind of cold that has opinions about you, that finds the gap between your collar and your scarf and makes itself at home there. The days shortened to almost nothing, light arriving late and leaving early like a guest who has somewhere better to be. The streets lost the brief warmth of December and became purely functional, places for moving through rather than being in. Marcus and Selin kept meeting on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Nothing had been declared, nothing had been decided. There had been no conversation in which the shape of what they were to each other was named and agreed upon. It existed instead in the accumulation of small, consistent things, the way she had started saving him the space beside the doors without making it visible, turning slightly to occupy 2 people's worth of room until he arrived. The way he had started leaving the office at a time that required effort, cutting conversations short, closing drawings mid-line to make the 6:52 rather than the next train. The way neither of them had suggested meeting anywhere other than the train. As if the train were a kind of agreement, a space that existed between their 2 worlds without belonging entirely to either. But the world Selin came from was not a world that stayed at a distance for long. In the second week of January, she arrived on a Thursday with something different in her posture, not visible to most people. But Marcus had spent 3 months learning her stillness, and he could read its variations now the way a musician reads dynamics, the same notes, different weight. She was carrying something. They rode 4 stops before she said anything. Then she said her father was coming to the city. Marcus waited. She said it was a scheduled visit. He had business here every January. It was not unusual. It was not, she said carefully, related to anything specific. Marcus understood from the precision of that last sentence that it was entirely related to something specific. He asked how long. 2 weeks, she said. He would be here 2 weeks. He asked what that meant for Tuesdays and Thursdays. She looked at the window, the city moving past in the dark. She said it meant she would need to be careful. The word careful landed between them with a weight she had not intended or had intended entirely. He turned it over. Careful, not impossible, not ending. Careful, a word that acknowledged the thing between them for the first time by treating it as something that could cause damage if handled wrong. He said he understood. She looked at him then, and he saw something in her face that he had not seen before. Not the measuring attention of the early weeks, not the careful warmth of the middle ones, something more exposed than either. The expression of someone who is holding two things that cannot both be held indefinitely and is beginning to feel the strain of it in her hands. She said she needed him to understand something else. He said, all right. She said her father was not a cruel man. She wanted him to know that. He was not a man who had built his world through cruelty or fear. He had built it through a genuine belief that certain structures, certain arrangements, certain careful alignments of family and influence were the responsible way to move through a world that was always more fragile than it appeared. She said she had grown up inside that belief, and it was not without its own logic. Marcus said he heard her. She said, and yet. He said, and yet. They rode in silence for a while, the kind of silence that is not empty but full, carrying everything that has been said and everything that has not been said yet, and the weight of both combined. At her stop she stood. She said she would be on Tuesday's train if she could. He said he would be there regardless. She paused at the doors. She said that was the part that was making everything complicated. Then she stepped off, and the doors closed, and he rode home through the January dark with the feeling of something tightening around the edges of what they had built in the narrow corridor of a train car over the last 3 months. Her father arrived on a Sunday. Marcus knew because she sent him the first message she had ever sent him, his number taken quietly at some point without ceremony, as she did most things without announcement. The message said simply, "He is here," nothing else. No punctuation at the end, as if the sentence was not finished or could not be. He read it standing in his apartment with his coat still on, having just come in from the cold, and he stood there for a while without taking his coat off. He typed back, "I know." He did not know anything, but it felt like the right response. She was not on Tuesday. He sat in the third car and watched the doors at her station open and close, and the platform empty and refill, and she was not among any of it. He rode to the end of the line and back, the old ritual, the one from before she existed in his Tuesdays, and it felt different now. Before, the riding had been about hope. Now it felt like the space that hope leaves when it steps out of the room briefly and you are not sure whether it is coming back. Thursday, she was there. She boarded at her original station, not the later one, and she was wearing a different coat, longer, darker, more formal somehow, the coat of a version of herself that moved in different rooms than the ones he had access to. She saw him and came directly to where he stood, and that directness itself was a statement of something. She looked tired. Not the surface tiredness of a missed night's sleep, but the deeper kind, the tiredness of sustained performance, of being precisely who you are required to be for long enough that you can feel the effort of it in your bones. He said nothing about any of this. He said hello. She said hello. They rode in the particular closeness of two people who have been apart for several days and are recalibrating the distance between them. Closer than before, he thought, or perhaps the same distance but more aware of it. She told him about the week in pieces, not the substance of it, the meetings, the conversations she sat at the edges of, the careful choreography of her days while her father was present, but the feeling of it, the sensation of moving through a world that had been built around expectations she had never been asked about and had for a long time not thought to question. She said something had shifted. He asked what. She said she kept thinking about what the man in the book thought, standing in the train station, watching something important happening just out of his reach. knowing he could not get to it from where he was standing. Marcus said he remembered. She said she used to read that scene as being about helplessness. She said she was beginning to think it was about something else. He waited. She said she thought it was about the moment before a person decides to move. The moment when staying still stops being neutral and becomes its own kind of choice. The train reached her stop. She stood. She said her father had mentioned, at dinner the previous evening, the name of the man she was expected to marry. Said it with the casual authority of someone confirming an arrangement so long established it had ceased to require discussion. She said she had sat at that dinner table and thought about a Tuesday evening in November when a stranger had caught a falling book and said nothing, and everything had begun to shift in a direction she had not planned for. She said she did not know what she was going to do with that. She stepped toward the doors. Marcus said her name. She stopped, turned. He said whatever she decided, whatever she needed to do or be or become on the other side of this, he was not going anywhere. She looked at him for a long time. Long enough that the doors began their warning sound, and she had to step through them quickly, and they closed behind her, and she stood on the platform in her long dark coat and looked at him through the glass with an expression he would carry with him for a long time. Not the almost smile. Not the real one. Something between them that had no name yet, but was working on getting one. The train pulled away. Marcus pressed his hand briefly against the cold glass of the door as it moved. He did not know if she saw it. He thought she did. He came on a Wednesday. Marcus was at his drafting table when the call came through, not from Selin, never from Selin during the day. That was one of the unspoken rules of the careful world they had built. But from a number he did not recognize, with a country code he had to look up. He almost did not answer. He answered. The voice was measured, older, carrying the particular authority of a man who had spent decades in rooms where his word was the last one spoken. His English was precise and lightly accented and gave nothing away. He said his name was Imre Karasay. He said he understood Marcus knew his daughter. Marcus said yes. There was a pause, not the pause of someone searching for words, the pause of someone who already has all the words and is deciding which ones to deploy first. He said he was in the city for 2 more days. He said he would like to meet. He said it the way people say things that are invitations in their grammar and instructions in their meaning. Marcus said when and where. They met the following morning in the dining room of a hotel that Marcus had walked past 100 times without ever going inside. The kind of place where the furniture was older than most of the buildings in his neighborhood, and the staff moved with the silent efficiency of people paid to be invisible. Emre Karasay was shorter than Marcus expected. Lean, upright, with the kind of physical stillness that accumulates in people who have learned that movement is a form of information and information should be rationed. He stood when Marcus approached, shook his hand, gestured to the chair across from him as if it were his own home. They ordered coffee. For a moment, neither spoke. Then the older man said he was not there to threaten him. Marcus said he was glad to hear it. Emre almost smiled, almost. The family resemblance in that almost was so precise that Marcus had to look away briefly. He said he was there because he was a man who preferred to understand things directly rather than through intermediaries. He said he had spent 40 years in rooms full of people saying things that meant other things, and he had no appetite for it in his private life. He said his daughter was not a simple person. Marcus said he knew. He said she carried responsibilities that were not of her choosing, but were nonetheless real. Marcus said he understood that too. The older man looked at him then with an attention that reminded him so completely of Selin that it was almost disorienting. The same quality, the same patience, the same sense of a conclusion being reached behind eyes that revealed nothing of the process. He said the man his daughter was expected to marry was a good man. Marcus said nothing. He said sometimes good is enough. Marcus looked at him steadily and said sometimes it isn't. The silence that followed was the longest of the conversation. Emre Karasay picked up his coffee, drank, set it down. He said he was not his daughter's jailer. He said he was also not a man who had built everything he had built to watch it redirected by a chance encounter on a train. Marcus said, with respect, he did not think it was chance. The older man looked at him sharply. Marcus said he thought some things that looked like chance were actually the outcome of two people being exactly who they were in the same place at the same time. And that was not nothing. That was not something you could plan or arrange or negotiate into existence in a room full of advisors. Emre was quiet for a long time. Then he stood, buttoned his jacket. The meeting was over. He said Marcus was either a very brave man or a very foolish one. Marcus said he had been told that before. The older man nodded once. Then he walked out of the dining room without looking back. Marcus sat alone with 2 coffee cups and the feeling of a door that had been neither opened nor closed. Just left exactly where it was, waiting to see who would move next. Selin called him that evening. Not a message, a call, the first one. He answered on the second ring and said nothing, and she said nothing, and for a moment the line just held them both in the particular silence of 2 people who are on the same call from different sides of a very large thing. Then she said her father had told her about the meeting. He said he thought he might. She asked what he had said. He told her all of it, the good man, the enough, the chance that was not chance. He did not edit or soften any of it, and she listened without interrupting with the full quality of her attention that he could feel even through a phone held in a cold apartment on the east side of the city. When he finished, she was quiet. Then she said her father did not tell her what he had concluded. Marcus said he did not think her father had concluded anything yet. She said that was unusual for him. He said maybe that meant something. Another silence, longer this time. She said she needed to tell him something she had not told him yet. He said all right. She said in 3 weeks she was expected in Ankara. A formal dinner, the kind of dinner that was not just a dinner, the kind where the arrangements that had been negotiated in rooms she was not present for would be made present in the form of her attendance and her composure and her willingness to let a future be decided in the language of other people's ambitions. She said she had been preparing to go. Past tense. Had been. He caught it, said nothing. She said she had been preparing to go because she was someone who honored her obligations, who understood that she existed inside a structure larger than her own preferences, who had grown up believing that love was not the primary architecture of a life, but one of several materials, not always the load-bearing one. She said she had believed that sincerely. She said she was less sure now. Marcus sat on the edge of his bed in his quiet apartment and looked at the brick wall outside his kitchen window and felt the entire weight of the last 4 months pressing against the inside of his chest, looking for a way out. He said he was not going to ask her to choose. She said she knew. He said he was not going to tell her what the right thing was because he did not think there was one right thing. He thought there were 2 real things and they could not both be fully honored, and she was the only one who could decide which cost she was willing to carry. She said that was either very respectful or very cowardly. He said it was probably both. A breath of something that was almost a laugh, almost. Then she said his name. The way she said it, not as a summons or a question, as a statement, the way you say the name of something you have decided to keep. He closed his eyes. She said she would call him when she knew. He said he would be here. She said she knew that too. The line went quiet. He sat in the dark for a long time after. Not waiting, just being where he said he would be. She did not call for 11 days. He did not count them as they passed. He told himself he was not counting them, he was absolutely counting them. The Tuesdays and Thursdays stopped, not because anything had been said about stopping them, but because the train without her was just a train and he was done pretending otherwise. He took the bus, the one that dropped him 2 streets from his apartment, direct, 22 minutes door to door, the route he had almost taken the evening he met her properly. He worked, he slept in fragments. He ate things that required one pan because somewhere in the last 4 months he had stopped cooking real meals without noticing. He called his sister on a Sunday and talked for an hour about nothing consequential and felt briefly human again, and then the call ended and the apartment went quiet, and the brick wall outside his kitchen window looked exactly as it always had. Patient, unmoved, indifferent to whatever was happening on this side of the glass. On the 11th day, his phone lit up at 11 p.m. One message. 3 words. I didn't go. He read it standing in his kitchen in his socks on the cold tile floor and read it again, and then set the phone face down on the counter and stood very still for a moment, the way you stand when something large has shifted and you are waiting to see if the ground is going to hold. He picked the phone back up. He typed, "Are you all right?" The reply came quickly, as if she had been holding the phone. She said she was not sure yet. She said she had told her father 2 days before the dinner, not by phone, in person, which had mattered to her. She had sat across from him in the same hotel dining room where Marcus had sat across from him, and she had told him she was not going to Ankara. She said he had been quiet for a very long time. Then he had asked her one question. He had asked if she was certain. She had said yes. He had nodded once. Then he had said that certainty was the rarest thing he knew, and he had spent his life trying to manufacture it through arrangement and structure and careful planning, and he was not sure anymore that any of it had produced the thing it was designed to produce. He had not given her his blessing, but he had not withdrawn his love. She said those were different things, and both of them mattered. Marcus read this standing on his cold kitchen floor and felt something open in his chest that had been closed for 11 days. He typed, "Can I see you?" She replied immediately. Tomorrow, the 6:52. He was there 40 minutes early. He stood in the 3rd car from the front with his hand around the overhead rail and watched the doors at each station with the open, undisguised attention of someone who is no longer pretending to be casual about anything. She boarded at her station. She walked directly to him. She looked different, not in any way he could have specified to someone who did not know her. The same coat, the same straight-backed composure, the same quality of attention in her eyes, but something underneath all of it had shifted. Something that had been held at a careful, managed distance was simply closer now, as if she had put down something heavy and was still adjusting to the feeling of her own hands empty. She stopped in front of him. He said hello. She said hello. Then she reached into her bag and took out a book, not one he recognized. She held it out to him. He took it. She said she had been carrying it for 3 weeks. She had bought it the day after the first Tuesday he had spoken to her on the platform. She had meant to give it to him 100 times and hadn't. He looked at it, then at her. She said it was the book that had stayed with her most, more than the one he had caught, more than any of the 437. She said she thought it might stay with him too. He held it in both hands the way she always held hers, felt the weight of it, the worn spine. He said, "Thank you." She looked at him with the most unguarded expression he had ever seen from her. No measuring, no careful management of distance. Just her looking at him in the full knowledge of what she had walked away from and what she was walking toward. She said the cost was real. He said he knew. She said her father's world did not simply stop existing because she had made a different choice. There were relationships altered, expectations unfulfilled, a man in Ankara who had done nothing wrong and would receive news that was not his fault and did not deserve. She said she was not without grief about that. He said she would not be her if she were. She looked at him then with something that was not quite the real smile and not quite tears, and was more honest than either. She said this was going to be complicated. He said he was an architect. He said complicated was just another word for a problem worth solving. She laughed. The real laugh, the sudden whole unguarded one that made everything in its vicinity feel briefly extraordinary. The train moved through the city, and she stood beside him, and the book was warm in his hands, and outside the windows, the January dark was giving way, barely, at the edges, to something that was not yet light, but was no longer entirely dark either. The beginning of something, enormous and uncertain, and entirely worth it. The complications arrived exactly as she said they would. Not dramatically, not in the form of confrontation or ultimatum or the kind of operatic crisis that makes consequence feel earned in stories and exhausting in real life. They arrived the way most real consequences arrive, quietly, in the margins, accumulating. Her phone calls home became shorter. The easy fluency she had described in her relationship with her father contracted into something more formal, more careful, the warmth still present, but banked low like a fire being managed rather than enjoyed. She mentioned it once, without making much of it. He heard everything she was not making much of. Her professional life shifted in ways she navigated without complaint, but not without cost. Certain doors in her world were connected to her family's world in ways that only became visible when the connection was under strain. A conference she had been expected to attend was quietly uninvited. A colleague who had been warm became neutral. The invisible architecture of a life built inside a powerful family made itself visible primarily through what began to be withheld. She carried all of it with the composure of someone who had made a clear-eyed choice and was not going to insult it by pretending the cost was smaller than it was. He watched her carry it and did not try to take it from her. That was the second test, not dramatic, not a confrontation in a hotel dining room with a powerful man across the table, just the daily quiet work of being present for someone who is paying a real price and does not want to be rescued from it, only witnessed. He learned what witnessing required. It required him to stop reaching for solutions. He was a man who solved structural problems for a living, who looked at a thing under stress and immediately began calculating what needed to be added or removed or redistributed to make it hold. She was not a structure, she was a person, and what she needed from him was not his competence. It was just him showing up. Tuesday and Thursday, the train, the walking in the same direction, the coffee that she made with ceremony and he drank with gratitude. The books exchanged now in both directions, a conversation conducted in margins and dog-eared pages, and the occasional note written in her small, precise handwriting that he found weeks later when he finally finished a chapter she had been waiting for him to reach. One evening in March, she was quiet for a long time on the train, and then she said she had spoken to her father that afternoon. He waited. She said it had been the first real conversation since January. He waited. She said he had asked about Marcus, not with warmth exactly, but with a genuine question beneath the asking, the kind of question that comes from a man revising his understanding of something rather than defending his original position. She said she had told him the truth, that Marcus was a man who had caught a falling book and said nothing, and shown up every Tuesday and Thursday for months, and sat across from her father in that hotel dining room, and told him that some things were not chance without flinching. She said her father had been quiet for a while. Then he had said he would like to meet him again. Properly this time. Marcus looked at her. She looked back. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then he said he would like that too. She nodded once. Outside the windows, the city was doing what cities do in March, not yet warm, but no longer entirely cold, caught in the uncertain middle of a change it had not finished making. Marcus thought about the brick wall outside his kitchen window, patient, unmoved. He thought about how he had looked at it for 3 years and found it comforting and had not known until now what it was he found comforting about it. It was still there every morning. Whatever else changed, it was still there. The second meeting with Emre Karasay happened on a Saturday in April. Not a hotel dining room this time. Selin's apartment. Small, warm, overflowing with books in 4 languages and a coffee setup that occupied more counter space than everything else in the kitchen combined. The kind of home that tells you everything about a person before they say a word. Her father arrived at noon. He shook Marcus's hand and looked at him with the same careful measuring attention his daughter had inherited and said nothing for a moment. Then he sat down at the small table by the window and accepted the coffee Selin placed in front of him and looked out at the city below with the expression of a man conducting an internal conversation he had not yet finished. They talked for 2 hours. Not about Selin directly, about other things, Marcus's work, the nature of structures designed to outlast their builders, Imre's early career, the years before the influence and the rooms and the arrangements, a young man from a provincial city who had built everything he had through the same quality his daughter carried, the refusal to be anything other than fully present and fully attentive in every room he entered. Marcus listened to him talk and understood where she came from more completely than he had before. Not just the weight she carried, the source of her strength. At some point, Selin left the table to make more coffee, and the 2 men sat alone for a moment in the quiet of the apartment, with the April light coming through the window and the city going about its Saturday below them. Emre looked at Marcus. He said he was not a man who was wrong often. Marcus said nothing. He said when he was wrong, he preferred to know it clearly rather than partially. He said he had spent 40 years building a world for his daughter based on a belief about what would keep her safe and whole and properly held. He said he still believed in that world. He was not going to pretend otherwise. But he said he had watched his daughter in the months since January, the steadiness in her, the particular quality of someone who has made a true decision rather than a convenient one and is living inside its consequences without flinching. He said he had not seen that quality in her in years. He did not say what had produced it. He did not need to. Marcus looked at him and said he would take care of her. The older man shook his head slightly. He said his daughter did not need taking care of. He said what she needed was someone who understood that. He picked up his coffee, drank. He said Marcus would do. It was not a blessing spoken in warmth or ceremony. It was the verdict of a careful man delivered in the plainest possible language after the longest possible deliberation. It was enough. Selin came back with the coffee and looked between the 2 of them and read something in the quality of the silence and set the cups down without asking. She sat beside Marcus. Her father looked at them both for a moment. Then he looked out the window at the April city, and the 3 of them sat in the particular quiet of something that has been carried a long way and finally, carefully, set down. Later, after her father had gone, they walked. No destination, just the city in April, the light lasting longer now, the cold finally loosening its grip on things. They walked along the river with their hands finding each other somewhere in the first block without discussion, the way things find each other when they have been moving toward the same point from different distances for long enough. She did not talk about the meeting. He did not either. At some point, she stopped walking and turned to look at the river, the late light moving on the water, and he stood beside her, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and he felt the weight of her, real and warm and present, and thought about a Thursday evening in November on a train running late, when he had reached for a falling book without deciding to. The smallest possible act. The largest possible consequence. He thought about the 6:52, the third car from the front, the overhead rail, all those Thursdays of almost and careful and not yet. He thought about her fingers brushing his when she took the book back, how he had stood at the doors for the rest of that journey with the warmth of it on his hand, like something he was afraid to close his fist around in case it disappeared. It had not disappeared. She tilted her head up and looked at him, and he looked back, and there were no more trains to ride past their stops, no more careful distances to maintain, no more waiting to see what kind of person the other one was going to turn out to be. They already knew, had known for some time. He kissed her there by the river in the April light, and she kissed him back with the same quality she brought to everything, fully present, entirely unhurried, as if this moment were the only one and she intended to be completely inside it. When they parted, she looked at him with the real smile. Not the brief, guarded, door-opening and closing version. The full one, warm and sudden and entirely without reservation. She said he was still the only stranger who had ever caught her book. He said he would catch it every time. She laughed. The real laugh. And the city moved around them, and the river carried the light away downstream, and somewhere across the water, a train crossed a bridge heading into the evening, and neither of them watched it go. They had somewhere to be. Right here. That was enough. That was everything. If this story stayed with you, click the video on your screen now for another story about two people who found each other in the most unexpected of places. Subscribe to You Know These Things and leave a comment telling us the smallest moment that changed the direction of your life. We read every single one.